This video was recorded at Zion United Methodist Church in Grand Forks, North Dakota on Wednesday, April 26, 2023. The content is the first in a four-part class on United Methodism 101. The presenter is Reverend Jerry Bass.
Gracious and loving God, as we continue in this season of Easter, let us be reminded each day that each and every waking hour is a new opportunity to show our love for you and to show your love for us as we love others. We ask you to be with us in this time, that your wisdom might perfuse this room, that as we learn a little bit more about your church, we might learn a little bit more about ourselves and especially a little bit more about you. May our relationship with you deepen in faith in this day and in every day. For this we pray. In Jesus' name. Amen. I call this UMC 101. I've done this as a new member class. I've done it as an old member class. I've done it for people from even another denomination who wanted to learn something about the Methodists. It's a class that I hope will be open to discussion, questions. I do not mind being interrupted at any time. There's enough material in here that we could go for 4 months as opposed to 4 weeks. So we will not cover everything there is to say about the United Methodist Church in these 4 weeks. And if I don't get to the end of my notes, that's okay. So as we go along, if you have comments, questions, just feel free to just jump in. We're going to start today by talking about the history of the United Methodist Church, or Methodism in general. So we're going to start out. A couple of you have seen this before, but I always start out by putting this in the context of kind of Christian history. And so I've got 4,000 years of Judeo-Christian history that we're going to do in about 2 or 3 minutes, or maybe a little bit longer than that. But here's your 4,000 years of Judeo-Christian history. We start out about 2000 BC, the time of Abraham. Now, these are rough approximations. These are not exact years. But we look back 4,000 years ago to the time of Abraham. What do we have as a religious heritage? We've got Judaism, the rise of the Hebrew people in the times of Abraham, and then much more specifically in the times of Moses, we have the arrival of the Jewish. So we are Jewish as far as our religious history going back 4,000 years. Now that lasts about 2,000 years until we have somebody by the name of Jesus comes along. There's no year zero, by the way, so we don't have a zero in the middle of that. But Jesus comes along and begins this movement within Judaism that eventually becomes Christianity. And so our heritage shifts from the Jewish Old Testament to the beginnings of the Christian New Testament, the gospel stories and everything that's happened since then. So we've got our Christian religion. Now, about 1,000 years later, around 1,000, the Christian church, which had been just one big denomination, I guess we could call it, it split. And the Eastern Church, which we now call Orthodox churches, split from the Western Church, which was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we can talk more next week about some of the doctrinal issues that caused them to split. But we had a major split. You have to grab a chair, Mark. And so we can trace our Methodists back to Roman Catholics, starting around 1000 AD. Now that lasts for about 500 years. What happened around 1500? People started to make major splits from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we didn't split from the church like the Lutherans did, from Martin Luther. We didn't split like the Reformed churches did with John Calvin. Our split was political. Our split was about that same era, in the 1500s, but our split was because of a fight between the King of England and the Pope in Rome. Henry VIII had married a Spanish princess, basically, and took her as a wife. Unfortunately, she was not able to give him a male heir to the throne. And finally, he kind of got disenchanted with his wife, and he wanted to have his marriage annulled so he could marry someone else. The Pope gets this request from King Henry VIII to annul his marriage to the Spanish princess. And the Pope's saying, okay, if I grant that annulment, the Spaniards are going to be really upset with me. Spain's a really strong Catholic country. On the other hand, if I don't give Henry's marriage an annulment, then the English are going to be upset with me. So who do I want to be upset with me, the English or the Spaniards? And he finally decided it was riskier to anger the Spaniards, so he refused to give Henry VIII an annulment for his marriage. Henry's reply was, okay, we're not Roman Catholic anymore. All the Catholics in England are now members of the Church of England, and I'm the head of it. It's my church, our church. And so our heritage, beginning around in the 1500s or so, becomes Anglican, or Church of England. And that continues for about 250 years until we have a movement in the mid-1700s that came to be known as the Methodists. Starting with John Wesley in the mid-1700s. This movement, now it became a movement within the Church of England. It wasn't a separate denomination at that time. We'll talk about how it became a denomination in just a little bit. So to summarize that whole sequence, we've got 200 years of Judaism in our heritage. We've got 1,000 years of Christianity. We've got 500 years of Roman Catholicism, 250 years of Anglicanism, and 250 years of Methodism. See how neat that works out? You use really rough estimates of dates. 4,000 years, half of it's Jewish, half of the remainder is Christian, half of the remainder of that is Roman Catholic, half of the remainder of that is split between Anglicanism and Methodism. And so here we are today, 4,000 years. So let's talk about United Methodist and United Methodist history. We have to talk about John Wesley. Everybody knows about John Wesley, right? Something about John Wesley. I assume everybody knows something about him. He came from a long line of pastors, preachers in the Church of England. His father had been a pastor, his grandfather, long history. Came from a large family. There's all kinds of details about his life that you can look up. We've got several books in the library about John Wesley if you want to read a whole lot more about him. I'm just going to skim some of the critical things. But he's recognized universally as the founder of what we call Methodism. And all began as a campus pastor. Now, I don't think Wesley was ever referred to as a campus. He wasn't a campus pastor, but his organizing around this idea that came to be known as Methodism began on a college campus. And when he was a student, he gathered with other students in a group that originally was called the Holy Club. The Holy Club met once a week, during the week. They were all Church of England members. They all went to church on Sunday. That was one of the expectations, was they would go to church on Sunday mornings. But they met one evening a week to do Bible study, hold each other accountable for holy living. That they would gather in a room, and as they went around, they had to tell each other whether or not they had abided by the 3 rules during the week, and they had to confess errors if they slipped and did not abide by their 3 rules. Now, the abbreviated means the 3 rules. First one was do no harm. So that's not something that seems too hard to do, except they held themselves to a real high level of accountability, a high bar. Even just speaking a word of objection or criticism could be seen as a violation of that rule to do no harm. And it's not only do no harm to people, but do no harm to your environment. And so they would go around and say, did you do harm to anyone this week? Second rule was do good. And they would report each week on how much good they had done. Wesley talked about doing all the good to all you can all the time. Just be a do-gooder. And the third rule was to attend to the ordinances of God. That's just a fancy phrase that means obey the first commandment, first great commandment, love God. So attending the ordinances of God would mean going to church on Sunday, receiving the sacraments, would be spending time in individual private prayer, scripture reading, scripture study. Those are the ways you attend the ordinance of God. So this model that began with the Holy Club eventually spread wider and wider through the following decades. And that's really what Methodism was in England, was these gatherings of people throughout the nation who would meet and kind of follow those holy rules, those three rules, and engage in Bible study and piety, prayer. So the Methodists got that name because of fellow students. And the Holy Club was criticized because they were so methodical in their organization and their attention to these rules and stuff that kids started teasing them by calling them Methodists and stuff. So we are Methodists because John Wesley and his Holy Club developed a very rigid method for their lives. So we're going to skip a little bit to a time when John Wesley decided that his call to ministry was really to be fulfilled in the English colonies. So he's going to come to America. And his goal, he told his fellow students and now by that time fellow preachers, was he was going to go and convert the natives to Christianity. So he made arrangements to come over to the colony of Georgia. And 1736, he gets on a ship, he and his brother Charles, and they head out to the English colonies. Well, while they're crossing the Atlantic, there's a terrible, terrible storm. And even the sailors are frightened, and they're worried that their ship might sink. And Wesley's thinking, here's my call to ministry. I've got to get to America so I can convert the natives, and I might not even get there. He's worried not only about his safety on the ship, but he begins to wonder whether or not if he were to die right there, if the ship sank, if he were to die, would he be saved? And he couldn't get a sense of assurance that he really would be saved. And so while he's fussing about all this, he hears this noise down below decks. He finds a group of Moravians who are heading also over to colonies. And they're down below deck, and they're praying together, and they're singing hymns, and they're not sad. They're smiling and joyous. And he's just very confused. Do they not realize that this ship might sink tonight? So in the following days, as they complete their journey, he starts visiting with some of their leaders. And he's trying to figure out, how could you possibly, in that dire strait, be singing with joy? And they said, well, because we have an assurance of our salvation. And Wesley just couldn't understand. He never had that same sense himself, that he really could feel assured that he would be saved. That bothered him literally through the rest of his life. There are notes in his journals and stuff, even in his later years, where he still sometimes wondered about his salvation. It was just a concern. And so if you have that wonder from time to time about, have I really been saved? Well, that's kind of a Wesleyan perspective. A bit of doubt is okay, I guess, from a Methodist perspective. So anyway, he survives the storm, gets over to Georgia, finds out that the colonial governance wants to keep the peace with the native tribes. And one of the ways they want to keep the peace with native tribes is keeping them separate. So when Wesley talks about, I'm going to go and meet these tribes and convert them to Christianity, he said, no. No. That's the last thing you were going to allow you to do. In fact, it's not only the last thing, you're never going to get to do that. We're going to send you to a village where you're going to be the pastor. And that's going to be your role. Do not attempt to make any contact whatsoever with the native tribes. So he's kind of frustrated and stuff, but he's dutiful, obedient, and so he begins his service. Now, there's a young lady living in that area by the name of Sophie Hopkins. Reportedly, Sophie Hopkins, a very attractive young woman in her teens. Wesley's in his mid-20s. And Wesley starts to fall in love with Sophie. But just as he had a need for assurance about his salvation, he also had a need to be assured that major steps in his life were consistent with his call to ministry. And so he and Sophie kind of start dating and courting. He has this sense of wonder, is this what I'm supposed to do? is marriage taking me away from my responsibilities as a pastor? Is this something God wants me to do, to get married? So he's hesitant. And Sophie's in love with John. John's in love with Sophie, but he just can't bring himself to make this proposal. Her parents had died when she was young. She's under the guardianship of a very high colonial official. And so the proper means would be for John to go and ask him for her hand, and he just can't bring himself to do that. He's just lacking insurance. Meantime, her uncle wants her to get married. That's what you do with young women in the colonies, and starts finding suitable suitors for his niece, Sophie. Eventually, Sophie basically gives up on John. This is never going to happen. Sounds like a Hallmark movie, you know. If he's not going to do this, so finally Sophie agrees to marry this other fellow. They get married. They go to England for their honeymoon. They come back to the colonies, and they show up at John Wesley's church on Sunday morning. And in the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, communion, just like in the Roman Catholic, is something you do in all your services. So as the people come forward for communion, and Sophie and her now husband come up, Wesley bypasses them and refuses to give them the elements of communion. Didn't play well. He is summoned to appear before government officials, and he is told the next ship going back to England is departing on such and such a date. You will be on that ship. And so after less than 2 full years in the colonies, John Wesley's back on a ship, heading back to England, totally wondering what his life is supposed to be. Love of his life is married. He's not sure what's going to happen. I'm not sure of my salvation. I'm not sure of my future. I'm just not too sure about anything. So he gets back to England, and he connects again with some Moravians and some of his Methodist friends, and starts attending a Bible study that's meeting at a house on Aldersgate Street in London. And one evening while they're in their meeting, Wesley, still doubting his call, wishing for assurance, went to the society. He actually wrote later, in the evening I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street. Reminds me, if I can go aside for a second, back in the fall of 1997, some of you remember the flood in the spring of 97, at Wesley we had a new Bible study called Disciple. We began that study in the fall, about 20 of us. And I went very unwillingly to the first session of that Bible study. My wife Gail wanted us to go together. I didn't want to go. I mean, it just wasn't something that terribly interested me at the time. So I was reading later that Wesley said, in the evening I went very unwillingly. Well, I always think about my going very unwillingly to that disciple class, which actually changed my life. I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing today if I hadn't gone to that disciple class. Well, God may have had other ways to get my attention, but that was the way that God got my attention. So Wesley wrote, in the evening I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warm. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. And Wesley used that phrase over and over through the rest of his life, that his heart had been strangely warmed. And I suspect if you were to pause and think about it, there are moments in your life where your heart may have been strangely warmed. Whether you realize it at the moment or later, that there were times when the Spirit was working within you, that Jesus had come and offered you assurance of forgiveness of sins. And you had that sense that, yes, things will be okay. So Wesley proceeded then from his Aldersgate experience to travel all over England. He never came back to America. I'm not sure we would have been allowed to come back to America, but we didn't have databases like we do with TSA now, no fly lists and those kinds of things. So he probably could have come back, but he had no desire ever again to come back, where he had that disastrous experience, disastrous romantic experience, disastrous ministry experience in Mary. And so he traveled. Now, one interesting thing about Wesley during that time is that he became very critical of the Church of England. Not its doctrine, but its practice. He felt that it was a high church, that it was a church that appealed to the elites of society, and that the ordinary people, and especially the poorer people, simply weren't welcome in the churches. And they really didn't attend the church. The church was for the rich and the famous and the connected, rather than for the rest of the population. So when Wesley was first appointed to a church after he got back from Georgia, his sermons were pretty critical of the people that were sitting in the pews. And that didn't go very well. And so people wanted a new pastor. And this happened several times, that Wesley's pastoral experience just did not play well with the people in the pews. And so eventually he just didn't get appointed to any churches. And so what did he do? He went to where the people were. And so he preached at the factory gates as the shifts were changing. He would stand out there, and his brother Charles would write new hymns. By the way, Charles is reported to have written over 6,000 hymns in his lifetime. And many of them were put to music. They were poems that he put to music with popular songs, even drinking songs. So as people were coming out of the factory gates, or he gathered people in the town square or out in the fields, people knew the tunes, and they would pass out song sheets so people could sing the new Wesley hymns to the tunes that they knew. And Wesley would preach. And they would travel, sometimes together, sometimes separately. But that's what he did the rest of his life. He traveled thousands and thousands and thousands of miles on horseback, going from place to place to place, preaching. Now, he always encouraged the people to go to church on Sundays as part of the Church of England. But he also tried to establish the small society groups that would gather during the week for their Bible study. That's how he spent the rest of his life. Now, where the United Methodism comes in, because Wesley was never a Methodist as far as the church was concerned. He was always an Anglican, member of the Church of England. So we have to switch to the colonies. We have to think about what was happening back in the 13 colonies as this war approaches. But before we get to the Revolutionary War, we have to think about people coming from England to the colonies. There were a number of people within those shiploads that had Methodist experiences in England. They'd been meeting with some of these Bible studies, and they'd become acquainted with this Methodist movement. So when they came over to the colonies, what was natural for them to do? Gather some other people, start a Bible study, and start the Methodism in the colonies. And so there were pockets throughout the colonies, especially in the middle colonies, where there were a number of Methodists that were gathering in the late 1700s. And so Wesley started, because these groups were there, he started to train people in England and deliberately send leaders over to the colonies to help organize these groups, to help guide these groups. Now, some of you are familiar with the word Cokesbury. You've maybe ordered books from Cokesbury or some church supplies from Cokesbury. Two of the people that John Wesley sent over to be leaders of the Methodist movement in the colonies were Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. Cokesbury, Asbury, and so we've got these two guys, but there were actually dozens of people that Wesley trained and sent over to the colonies. So as the Revolutionary War approaches, as this divide between the English colonies and the nation of England, began, we have these movements, but we still have all those people as members of the Church of England. Well, then the war starts. What do people want to do? They're fighting against George III to separate their land, the colonies, from his land, England. Well, if he's the head of the Church of England, do they really want to continue to be members of George's church. And so throughout the colonies, these Anglicans, these Church of England congregations start discussions about what are we going to do. We don't want, some of them said, we don't want anything to do with the Church of England. We're done with it. And so as they get to the time when the war is ending, and this desire to separate from England, both as a nation and as a church, the Anglicans kind of evolved into two frames of thought. And one frame of thought was that we really want to have ties to our Anglican heritage. We want to continue to worship as Anglicans. We want to, but we just don't want to have that direct connection to the king. And so those people organized congregations, organized a church that came to be known as the Episcopal Church. So if you were to go to St. Paul's and look at their heritage, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Grand Forks, their heritage goes back to the same people that ours do, back to the English colonies, but they wanted to continue to have some ties with the Anglican Communion. So the Episcopal Church still has ties to the Church of England, but they're not part of it. They're in a broader affiliation. But there were many colonies that wanted no relationship whatsoever with the Church of England anymore, and those are the people that evolved into the Methodist Episcopal Church. And so in the post-war era, those leaders that Wesley had sent over eventually convened a group of Methodists. They met in Baltimore, what they called the Christmas Conference, and they organized the Methodist Episcopal Church. So that's the first time that the Methodists had a denominational understanding. This is who we are as a nation. As a church.
When you say, we talk about the Episcopals then, but now then, the ones that broke away totally, we call them Methodist Episcopalians or Episcopalian?
Yeah, the official name of the church adopted at that Christmas conference was the Methodist Episcopal Church.
And that's what Wesley started out as.
It was in the cornerstone of the First Methodist Church. And then I think at Wesley as well.
Yeah. Wesley was the United Methodist Episcopal Church.
Yeah. That's where it was.
And we're going to talk about structure of the church in a couple of weeks, so we'll get back to that, how the name changes and stuff occurred. But the church that we, as United Methodist, that branch, the kind of the Methodist branch, was the Methodist Episcopal Church from the 1780s until actually 1938. 1938, they dropped the Episcopal from the church.
What year was it?
1938. We'll talk about that more in 2 weeks. So other questions or comments at this point? We've gone from John Wesley roaming around the countryside and forming these groups to now having a natural denomination with all the rules and structure and everything that goes with that. But the Methodist, only one side, obviously it's my side of the United Methodist Church, so I tend to favor that Methodist side. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. Actually, I should pause and have a moment of candor. And I actually grew up as a Roman Catholic. So my home religion was Catholic. My dad grew up as a Methodist in New Rockford, and so he fell in love with a Catholic back in the 1940s. And Irish-German Catholic fathers did not let Irish-German Catholic daughters marry Methodists. And so he went away to join the Navy right at the end of World War II and ended up on a ship in the Pacific with a Catholic priest as the chaplain on board. And when he came back from the war, he was a Catholic, much to the chagrin of his mother and brothers and sisters. And so I was raised a Catholic. And then years later, I fell in love with a young woman who just happened to be a United Methodist. And during our premarital counseling in Bismarck at McCabe United Methodist Church with Reverend Dave Connett, some of you may have heard of Dave, we're doing premarital counseling, and Dave reminded me over the years since then that, as he recalls it, we spent more time in our premarital counseling sessions answering my questions about the Methodist Church than we did talking about our relationship with Gail and I. And until he passed away, Dave was a dear friend of ours. So I became a Methodist. So that's my side. But there's another side to the United Methodist Church, and that's actually brethren and evangelicals. So we need to talk about that part of our history, which is every bit as important as the Methodist side. And so we're going to look at two people that were involved in forming new denominations about the same time that the Methodist Episcopal Church was getting started. We also have a movement actually a couple of movements in America. Interestingly enough, they both were based in German language groups. They were a congregation of people who worshiped in German, had come from Germany. And so these generic terms, the brethren and the evangelicals, grew out of the work that was being done in the colonies, again, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Two people. The fellow on your left is Martin Bain. He was a Mennonite by his upbringing. And Philip Otterbein is on the right, and he grew up in a Reformed church. So we've got a Mennonite and we've got a Reformed person who were in German-speaking congregations in the new United States of America. Interestingly enough, they both had ties to Wesley from time that they had spent in England. And interestingly enough, when these two gentlemen passed away, their funerals were actually conducted in England, and John Wesley spoke at both of them. So there's a tie that goes back to the very earliest days of the United Methodist Church between these groups. And in fact, the Confession of Faith that was adopted by the United Brethren, these two formed the United Brethren Church. And their statement of what they believed, called the Confession of Faith, was actually adopted in 1815. It had been written by Philip Otterbein, the guy on the right, back in the late 1700s. But he had used a copy of the Articles of Religion of the Church of England as a guide to writing his Confession of Faith. So there's Methodist Anglican ties to these German-speaking folks as they began their church. There's another fellow that needs to come up. His name is Jacob Albright. And Jacob Albright was also involved in another group of German-speaking churches. They were called the Evangelical Church. And it's interesting because Albright also had some ties to John Wesley, as well as to the founders of the Evangelical Church, the United Brethren. And in fact, at one time, Albright had been a member of a Methodist society in the English colonies. He spoke English, spoke German. He was tied to a German church, but he met with an English-speaking Methodist society. And he traveled around the colonies, up and down, especially in the middle colonies, and especially in like Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia. And he wanted to organize a group, a formal church as the Revolutionary War was coming to an end. And they knew that this was going to be a new nation. And he initially called his organized congregations the German Methodist Church. But he was told by Methodist leaders in the United States, then this Methodist Episcopal Church, he was told, no, you can't do that. You can't do that because we are an English-speaking church. We Methodists are English. And you can't use the word Methodist if you're going to be a German-speaking church. And so they made him stop calling his church as the German Methodist Church. And so he called the newly organized church the Evangelical Church. But it's interesting that he took the Methodist Episcopal Book of Discipline, translated it into German, and used that as the original guide for organizing his Evangelical Church. So we've got this German group, we've got this, and in fact, the German influence in both of these, the United Brethren and the Evangelical Church, continued for many, many years. That period. But that wasn't unusual as we came out of the colonies into the United States. English became the official language of the United States of America. But how many of you remember growing up in a town that might have had a German Baptist church, or a Swedish Lutheran church, or a Danish Lutheran church? Still, even in our lifetime, we've still kept some of those old ties. So we've got these two denominations formed by these three guys. And in 1946, the two that formed the EUB, so the Evangelical Association and the United Brethren, in 1946 merged together as one denomination and called themselves the Evangelical United Brethren. If you look at some of the folding chairs in the church here, I think there's still EUB on the back of the chairs. So we've got our Evangelical United Brethren Church, and we've got our Methodist Episcopal Church. They united in 1968, formed the United Methodist Church.
What's interesting here, though, if you go in the workroom, there's boxes and all the documents are written in German.
The time boxes and there's a whole large book that we have in this case out here. It is all in German with the first members of the. I'll have to show it to you.
Well, there's a subject in Methodism that, and in the Methodist churches, denominations, that the Evangelical and United Brethren really never dealt with. They weren't in a position where they had to deal with that. And that was racial strife and division within Methodism. In the first half of the 1800s, Methodism became the largest denomination in the United States. There were more Methodists in the United States than any other religious group. And part of it was because as the frontier expanded and people moved further and further west into the prairies eventually, they didn't have to have an ordained pastor to form a church. Lay speaking and lay pastors had been a very common tradition going back to when Wesley was organizing his societies in England. And the society leaders that met during the week for these Bible studies, they were not ordained clergy. And for many people, that was their only religious contact. They didn't go to church on Sunday because they didn't like the preaching in the Anglican church. So the Methodists had a tradition of lay leadership. And so as the Methodists moved out into the frontier, as soon as they could get some like-minded people, they would start a society-like group, usually started as a Bible study. They'd meet in a home. But eventually those grew and became more formal congregations. So it was easy. So you didn't have to wait for a bishop to ordain somebody and send a pastor. You could just kind of do it on your own. Do it yourself, religion. But it would never known as DIY, I guess. But that's kind of what was happening. And so throughout the United States, we've got Methodists all over the place, north and south. So what's happening in the 1800s, as we go closer and closer to the middle of that century, there's more and more conflict about slavery. And there's a strong Methodist presence in the south, there's a strong Methodist presence in the north. In 1850, a group of Methodist churches tried to get the Methodist Episcopal Church to take a formal, strong stance against slavery. And as they met in their once every 4-year conference, the church refused to take that strong stand against slavery. And so a group of the Methodist Episcopal churches broke away, and they formed what's called the Methodist Protestant Church. So we got a group that said, if you're not going to take that stand against slavery, we can't be part of you anymore. And so they left. Well, then, in the next 10 years, obviously, as we're approaching Civil War, slavery becomes even more and more a volatile issue. And as the Civil War breaks out, what happens to the Methodist Episcopal Church? It splits in half. The Confederacy, the area of the Confederacy, basically all the Methodist Episcopal churches, they're separated from the rest of the Methodist Episcopal churches and create the Methodist Episcopal Church South. So in the north, you got the MEC, Methodist Episcopal Church. In the south, you got the MECS, Methodist Episcopal Church South. Those churches did not get back together again until the 1900s. So we've got this division. Now, when they got back together again in the 1930s, 1930s was not known as a real desegregation time in the United States. Integration was not a high priority in a lot of the country. So when the Methodist Protestants, and the Methodist Episcopal, and the Methodist Episcopal South started talking about, let's get back together again. Let's reform this United Methodist organization, or a United Methodist organization. Issues about race were kind of front and central because there were a lot of black congregations and black individuals who were part of Methodist congregations or part of the Methodist Church, especially in the North. And Southerners were afraid that they didn't want ever to have a black bishop. They didn't want to ever have to have a pastor who was a person of color. And so one of the real obstacles to creating this unity for Methodism was race. Still there. And so what they did was they carved out an exception, and they said, okay, we're going to organize our church by geographical regions, except all of the black congregations are going to be put into a separate group. I'll talk more about that in 2 weeks when we talk about the structure. But they basically said, okay, all the white congregations, those of you in this area of the country are together, and those of you in this area of the country are together, this area and this area and this. But all of the United States, all the black congregations, we're going to set you aside as a separate group. Now, one of the things that did was to make sure that black pastors who were ordained within that group would not be appointed to white churches in the other regions. But it also, interestingly, guaranteed that there would be black bishops, because that separate black organization could elect their own bishops and ordain their own clergy. So on the one hand, we guaranteed that black churches would have black clergy and black bishops, but we also guaranteed to the white churches that they would never have to have leadership. It's not white. I talk about racial strife. Now that is ended, but this is part of our heritage. It shows how cultural and religious issues are not always real easily defined, and how the culture can intervene within the religious efforts within a denomination. Comments or questions?
When you talked about that, I went to a church in Valdosta, Georgia, totally white. And afterwards I asked my cousin, I said, don't black people go here? Oh, they can. But nobody does anything. They aren't asked to sing in the choir. They don't participate in the church. So she said they read. She said it's an easy way to keep it all white. And that's now.
Well, that's true of our society.
10 years ago.
Well, how many black people do we have coming to Zion? How many black people do we have coming to Wesley?
Peter.
We have Peter coming to Zion.
Peter.
And we had one family coming to Wesley in recent years. Yeah.
That couple that was here, he was
Well, how
black.
many white people go to Bishop Cole's church?
Oh, maybe they do. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know either. 42nd.
We've been
My
invited.
kid. Huh?
We've been invited. Jim and Bishop Cole got to be friends down at the YMCA, so we have been invited, and I want to go. But my husband's hard to take places sometimes. He doesn't like new things.
But what denomination is that?
I don't know.
I think
Let's go.
they're affiliated with
I love their
they're
music.
I should I don't.
Is it gospel outreach?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah. it's different. I didn't go there, but I went to one that's out in Rapid City to a black gospel outreach church, and it's quite different. So Jim might not be comfortable because you got to dance your offering up because they're always dancing.
I'll have to
Not
order
a-
him up first.
It's an exactive.
Okay. We're going to do it. I mean, it's just on that bucket list. So
I don't know, but knowing a little bit I've seen of Bishop Cole, they probably are dancing their offerings. That's
it's a great
a
guy.
thing. Yeah.
When I've been walking on 24th up to 42nd, there's been some women, you know, that go there and invited us to come, you know, but we just haven't done it.
So we had this unification of the Methodists, and they dropped the Episcopal, by the way, in 1938 when the Methodist Protestant and the Methodist Episcopal and the Methodist Episcopal South joined together. They said, okay, we're going to simplify these. From now we're just going to be known as the Methodist Church. And then we got about, roughly that same time period, we've got the United Brethren and the Evangelical Association coming together to create the Evangelical United Brethren Church. So this theme of unification, which was quite different from the theme of division in the previous century or so. But now, one of the elephants in the room in a lot of Methodist congregations right now has to do with the divisiveness. And I think it's part of our history that's evolving right now. History is not just what happened in the past, but history is also what's happening right now. And 10 years from now, 20 years from now, people will look back on this era, and this will be a very important part of whatever a class like this would be called 10 years from now or 20 years from now. What's happening right now will be part of that instruction. Probably fairly important part of that instruction. Because now, as of May 1st of last year, a new denomination was formed called the Global Methodist Church, the GMC. And Global Methodist Church is growing by leaps and bounds. It's not a formally organized denomination yet. I mean, it was formed and registered, as a non-profit, all that kind of legal stuff. But they have not yet approved all their governing documents. They've got a draft of a book of discipline and those kinds of things. They're waiting for things to kind of settle out so they see who they have as part of that. But the last number I saw, in fact, just yesterday, in the last 15 months, nearly 2,500 United Methodist congregations have left the United Methodist Church. Have finished all of the work, all of the steps to disaffiliate, is the term that's being used. So nearly 2,500 have officially disaffiliated as of right now. My guess is that the number will go up by at least half before the end of this year. So the numbers are going up.
So that group, are they pro-gay or are they the other ones?
It's a much more conservative, theologically and socially, politically, I guess I would have to say too. This is not slavery, but the front and center issue is human sexuality. It's a little more complicated than that. In fact, it's a lot more complicated than that. But that's the one issue right now. The only, according to, let me back up a little bit. When the Methodist Episcopal Church started in the 1700s, and they adopted a book of discipline, which was their governing document, it required that any church property owned by a congregation had to be held in trust for the larger general church. And so, if you were to look at Zion's deed that is registered, in the courthouse, there's a trust clause on there that says that this property is held in trust for the Methodist Church, or the Methodist Episcopal Church, or the United Methodist Church, depending on when that deed was last filed. which means over the years, if a congregation wants to close, as Wesley did, or once the people want to leave the United Methodist Church, they had to turn the property back to the general church. That's why the Dakota's Annual Conference trustees now have possession of Wesley's property, the church property. Wesley did not have the authority on their own to sell that property or to otherwise dispose of it without permission of the church. Well, all these congregations over the years, last few years, have wanted to leave the United Methodist Church because they thought the United Methodist Church was moving in a direction that they found offensive and did not want to go that direction. But with the trust clause, if they were to leave, they would have to leave all that property, including cash reserves, foundational money, to the United Methodist Church. And so there's been a reluctance, obviously, to leave, and there have been a lot of lawsuits over that, battles in various states. And in 2019, at a special gathering, the United Methodist Church created a maybe call it once in a lifetime, a window of opportunity for congregations to disaffiliate, to leave the United Methodist Church, and keep their property under certain circumstances. There's some financial obligations, but interestingly enough, the only reason that a congregation could use to disaffiliate was objections to the church's stand on homosexuality. So just as the MEC and the MEC South split over slavery, now the UMC and the GMC are kind of, it's not really a split. It's more of people leaving and joining another group. That's semantics more than anything else. But the only reason that a church can disaffiliate right now is because of issues over sexuality. So that's the front and center issue within the church. In our area, I only know of, in northeastern Dakota, I only know of 2 churches that have moved in that direction. Crystal, some of you know where Crystal is, some of you probably don't know where Crystal is, north of Grand Forks. Very small congregation, probably not more than a dozen or 15 members nowadays. They have actually voted to disaffiliate. The Trinity United Methodist Church in Cavalier actually has a vote coming up next week, I believe, to vote on disaffiliation. I don't know of any other churches that are in that process in our area, but there are several dozen, more than several dozen now in the Dakotas who have already made that decision to leave. So unification was kind of the theme of the 1900s. Now we're in the 2000s. We're back to divisiveness. I think is kind of the theme of the churches. Comments or questions about that part? I'm going to spend days talking about that. We'll probably come back to it when we do the structure.
Well, just from a financial standpoint, if you have that many churches choosing to disaffiliate, and you have now a very large global Methodist group, and then you have United Methodist, how does that impact then financial stability of United Methodist? And because if it's going to be, it's a larger scope, because there is financial aspects involved with that.
There are a number of, in the Dakotas, obviously, probably getting ahead of my 2-week class where we talk about structure. So I don't want to get too far into that, but suffice to say that United Methodist churches are organized into geographic areas, and the area we're in is the Dakota's Annual Conference, which is North and South Dakota. There are a number of large congregations that have already taken the votes to disaffiliate, including Aberdeen First and Cornerstone and Watertown, and so those churches, because of their contributions to the conference budget and everything, there's going to be a major impact on how we organize. We need to wait and let everything kind of settle out. The churches that are leaving cannot leave with their property or anything until after a vote by the annual conference, by the collective churches in the Dakotas. So there's a special meeting that's scheduled for, I think, August 15th. So all the churches that have voted to disaffiliate by them but have not already been approved will be voted on August 15th. They have until December 31st to leave under the current rules. That's that window that was created for churches to leave. The bishop has said that August 15th will be the last time we need to vote on that, but I would guess that there'll be churches that will be voting to disaffiliate sometime after that, so we'll have to have another vote towards the end. So we don't know right now what the full impact will be. It's less serious kinds of things. I mentioned that John Wesley was always a member of the Church of England. He was never a Methodist as a church identification, which is kind of interesting. The founder of Methodism was never a Methodist. I talked about his brother Charles and his 6,000 hymns. What's your favorite Charles Wesley hymn? Who can think of a Charles Wesley?
Lift up your heads, ye mighty gates. That's there's a whole bunch of them.
Oh yeah, in fact, it's kind of a teaser because once I start throwing out something, I didn't realize that was Charles Wesley. Hark the herald angels sing. Charles Wesley, one of the great Christmas songs, one of the great Easter songs. Christ the Lord is risen today. Where you sing 4,015 Alleluias before you get done with the song. All love's excelling. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing. Which, by the way, has been the first hymn in every Methodist hymnal ever created back to those days when they passed out song sheets out in the fields. Over 1,000 tongues to sing. Current United Methodist hymnal has 17 verses for that song. And I always threaten that some Sunday we're going to sing. Never did. One of the great Advent songs, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. Also a Charles Wesley song. But another less serious kind of topic is, why do we have grape juice as an element of communion in the United Methodist Church? When Catholics get wine, Lutherans get wine, Episcopalians get wine, why do we get grape juice?
Because Methodists are teetotalers.
Exactly. Well, not all of it. Back in the 1800s, there was a real interest in trying to figure out a way that Methodist churches could do communion without serving wine. But there was no commercially successful way of preserving grape juice without turning it into wine. And so there was an effort by various people to try and do that. And there's a dentist by the name of Thomas Welch back in the 1860s. Thomas Welch, dentist and fervent, faithful Methodist, set out on a crusade to find a way to pasteurize. Louis Pasteur had developed pasteurization for milk. Welch said, if you can do it for milk, why can't you do it for grape juice? And so for years he experimented with ways to pasteurize grape juice. And usually what happened was he'd do this and it would do what grape juice usually did. It would either ferment into wine, or it would grow mold, or it would turn into vinegar, or vinegar-like liquid. I mean, it just wasn't palatable. And finally, in 1869, he patented Dr. Welch's unfermented wine. Dr. Welch's unfermented wine, and started producing it. And his motivation was to have that available for communion. But it wasn't very successful as an enterprise. I mean, we didn't have national advertising or the internet for sales or anything like that back in 1869. So after about 3 or 4 years, he actually shut down his operation for a couple of years. But then a movement grew very rapidly in the United States, the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And as the WCTU grew as an anti-alcoholism, abuse of alcohol grew. The interest grew exponentially to have a non-alcoholic beverage served at communion. And all of a sudden, people remembered Dr. Welch's unfermented wine. His son started the operation back up again and very quickly became successful because WCTU chapters across the country started promoting juice. So that's how we got to grape juice. Because of Dr. Thomas Welch, was unfermented wine. Great Methodist story.
When we moved here in 1967, I believe it was, and I was in 8th grade, and it was the first time in my life I went to a church that wasn't Methodist because my grandparents, I'd gone to First Methodist downtown every time I stayed in Grand Forks with Grandma and Grandpa, and taken to Sunday school in Bemidji when we were at the lake with them at the Methodist Church in Bemidji. We were Methodists in Warren when we lived there. Came here and joined the EUB church, and I thought, I'm free of Methodism. And it was even within the year that it changed its name. I guess I'm Methodist. Yeah.
You sometimes say, what's in the name?
Exactly.
And sometimes the names have huge symbolism, huge importance.
It's all one God. We all worship the same God.
And yet last fall, when we met some of us met as class last fall, we talked about Christian denominations. We spent all our time talking about why we have all these different denominations. Why do we have Baptists and Lutherans and Episcopalians and Methodists and Catholics and Orthodox? And every one of those you can trace back to some argument that people had that dealt somehow with God, or with how they thought God thought people ought to behave, what people ought to believe.
Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for our church, for the denominational histories, for the traditions, for the experiences of our forebears, as well as our own experiences within the church. As we leave now, guide us into a remarkably nice day. Help us to find a restful night, and help us to be refreshed in the morning. As we continue through this Easter season, may we indeed find new life in each and every day. We thank you for the wisdom that guides your church, and for the conversation and the fellowship that we experienced around this table. Be with us in this day and all days, we pray this in Jesus.
If you would like to receive copies of class handouts or of the PowerPoint slides, please send your request to the address at the bottom of the screen. Our next session will focus on doctrines and beliefs of the United Methodist Church. In preparation for that time, participants were given a copy of the Articles of Religion of the UMC. You may obtain a copy by Googling that term or making your request to my email address. I hope you will join us again for our next session of UMC 101.